Welcome to your continued coverage of the 51st session of the Economic Commission for Africa and the Conference of Ministers. On Twitter, the conversation has been going on under the hashtag 2018com. My name is George Ndirango, and for today's session, we jump right into the heat of things. 6 of the countries most corrupt in the world are right here in Africa, in our very own backyard. So today, for the opening sentiments, we get to hear from the Executive Secretary of the Commission, Vera Songwe, to just guide us through some of the modalities that they've noted would work for the corruption conversation, and whether we should see a lot more accountability to the public, investors and potential investors within the continent.
The conversations have been quite exciting. When we decided to have the conversation around the Continental Free Trade Area, we were not exactly convinced that that was going to be what would be the most exciting. But I think we see finance ministers very engaged. Right. And this is the right way to go. I think that finance ministers, of course, are the ones who are the masters of the borders, they're the masters of the customs, they're the masters of the taxes. And so having finance ministers, I think, particularly engaged, behind the CFTA and dedicated to making it happen is an important element. Difficult to understand where it all started, but I think that what we now know is that if you have strong institutions, if you have good processes, then it's easier to tackle corruption. And just to throw out a few numbers, altogether, the total cost of corruption on the continent now is almost about $1 trillion. This is everything put together. We need about $600 million a year to finance the Sustainable Development Goals. So the question is, it's so obvious that we are losing out on growth, we are losing out on a better future, we are losing out on Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, because of corruption. The petty corruption, but also the grand corruption. And we are hoping that as part of some of the processes that we put in place, the digitalization, we know for sure that you have more corruption when you have human contact. So if you can reduce the amount of human contact, you can clearly reduce the amount of corruption. And part of what we're doing with the free trade area is saying, how can we make sure that countries trade with each other without necessarily having this continuous human contact? How can we remove border controls? And this is why we need finance ministers to work with us to ensure that we can make some of those processes seamless. I think one of the numbers that always comes to mind is the fact that if you're a woman in West Africa trading across boundaries, you have to pay almost from $2 to $23 per kilometer of different kinds of payments to move your goods. This is not sustainable if we want a continent that is going to grow, if we are looking for an Africa we want.
There's a bit of an imbalance. You put in so much resource to try and tackle the issues on corruption, but the revenue or the take-home doesn't match it.
Well, I think that it's an effort that is long-term. And it's an effort that we can ensure that as we make it work, it becomes better. And again, the question is about the critical mass that you need to then shift the dial on corruption. Today, what we're saying is that for most institutions that are corrupt, we're losing a lot more revenue than we are creating, than we are collecting. Hence the discussion around the informal economy. The informal economy is a little bit of a password for corruption, because we say we don't know them, so they can't pay their taxes. And we are hoping that with trade and with the institutions and the implementation of the Boosting Inter-Africa Trade Strategy, we will be able to put in place policies and systems that will reduce the size of the informal sector.
We have contracts that go way back and still are yet to go 20 to 30 more years with people or partners outside the continent. So what kind of conversations are happening about maintaining the revenue here, at least local or consumption the same?
We've been having a lot of discussions around how one can bring in transparency into the process, and we're actually looking at a few norms which we're now playfully calling 5x5 norms, which we'll come back to at some point. But it's about transparency, it's about contracting, it's about ensuring now, because we've been talking about illicit financial flows, because we've been talking about base erosion and price shifting, which is basically the way a lot of the large corporates, and the Thabo Mbeki report shows that about 65% of the illicit flows come from corporations. So how can we do that? And the EU is now looking at those issues. So I think that what we've been able to do, and this is part of the mandate of the ECA, is the whole global governance and global advocacy around some of these big issues. So what we are looking at is to say, how can we make sure that if you have a bad contract, even if it's going for 30 years, that we open it today and we revise it. So again, the economic Pan-Africanism. If all of Africa says we want to look at all those contracts and reopen them, because the companies are going to be interested in staying in Africa, they will open them. But if one country says, I'm going to open it, then very quickly that country can get chastised for saying, oh, you know, there's no stability of contracts. So it has to be a collective effort, and that's where ECA and the African Union and the African Development Bank as Pan-African institutions are saying, we can come behind the countries, we can come behind the continent. So we're now having a global mining contract, which is going to be stabilized for the continent. So there is no race to the bottom inside the continent, and corporations that come from outside can look at it and say, okay, I can negotiate something for country A and a different thing for country B. So that kind of transparency that we are asking for, not only from our countries, but also from the investor countries. We're asking the Europeans, we're asking the Canadians, we're asking the Australians to ensure that the kinds of contracts that their companies negotiate on the continent are robust, is where we are, is the kind of discussion that ECA is particularly leading in this era.
Now, in regards to inter-African trade, we're currently looking at 16% trading within the continent, but the estimations are that we should see this reach over 50% by 2022. Now, with only 4 years to go, we were curious about whether the regions are having the same conversation or how replicable they are in regards to growth. Take a look.
For North Africa, there is a strategic vision and strategic view to be more integrated with the rest of Africa, basically, and create more exchange and more trade with the rest of Africa. So for now, we know that the CFTA has been signed. The protocol has been signed, and I think this is an expression of the keen interest of North African countries to integrate the continental free trade area.
So what happens to the markets that we have already established long over the last couple of years in Asian markets, American markets, within our manufacturing? I mean, if we are telling them to retain that inter-African trade, we have to back it up with numbers and demand.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, those markets will still, at least that is what we believe at ECA, those markets will continue and will still be there. What we're trying to promote through the AFCFTA is really to increase trade within the African continent. If you look at the statistics specifically, you will see that some of the products that are produced by countries in the continent are actually imported from Europe, from the United States, from Asia. So why go so far when you have the product next door? And this is what we're trying to capitalize on in terms of opportunities. Of course, this will take, first of all, there is a need to implement the CFTA in itself, meaning that it becomes really applicable and operationalized. And second, to reduce all the trade obstacles and barriers that exist today. They could be just administrative or logistical or in terms of infrastructure. This needs to be reduced for this potential to happen. But it's not going to take away necessarily maybe part of the trade with other parts of the world, but not necessarily the whole trade with the other part of the world. I think we cannot separate.
You cannot afford to have three monitoring framework different in a country, where you have one for your national development plan, another one for the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, and the third one for Agenda 2030. Because what feeds monitoring a framework are data, and data are very expensive to produce, to put together, so that they can be used in terms of indicator to follow up on a framework. That's why at the ECA, we are pleading for member states to work on a unique framework that will be feeding the three monitoring framework that we are talking about. National Development Plan, Agenda 2030, and Agenda 2063. Because the underlying source of what is needed to come up with a framework are data. So you need to produce data on a range, an array of issues, economic, social, environmental, and perception of people on one or other issues related to their access to services.
Is that the same reasoning behind the Sahel and the conversation that you're championing tomorrow?
The Sahel is actually countries from the Sahel are doing the same thing. Now, why are we putting emphasis and having a special event on the Sahel tomorrow? As any other African countries, countries from the Sahel do face a number of challenges, structural challenges, lack of diversification, lack of transformation, population dynamics, migration. But for the last 2 or 3 decades, we have seen that those problems have been exacerbated by a number of factors, including insecurity, including climate change issues. To give you an example, when you look at countries that are around Lake Chad, this lake, 40 years ago, it had several people living, having their livelihood around that lake in terms of fishing, in terms of agriculture, in terms of people coming with their cattle to come for water. That very lake is now at 1/10 of the area that it was covering 40 years ago. So that means you have movement of population going toward the remaining of the Lake Chad. So all these have been putting a lot of pressure on already vulnerable and challenged countries. Although the challenges that we have are huge, and no institution can actually think that they can solve this problem, help countries to solve this problem alone, but there's a need to make sure that these different strategies talk to each other. That is why, in terms of the UN, as you know, we have funds, program, secretariat, and other agencies, but we have made sure that we have a unique UN strategy. That's why it is called United Nations Integrated Strategy for the Sahel.
Right, and that about sums it up. The conversations on illicit financial flows have been highlighted over the last couple of days within the sessions, a lot more deliberately than has been over the last couple of years. And of course, we've heard from the Economic Commission of Africa to just get a perspective on where the conversations are leading in regards to corruption. We had region by region on whether we see any best practices or replication, and you can bet the conversations continue. We are not yet done. We have just a few more days to continue coverage of the 51st session of the Economic Commission for Africa, so stay tuned right here on CNBC Africa. My name is George Ndurango. Thank you very much for watching.